Well, good afternoon. My name is Bob Skelton, and I'm ASAE's Chief Administrative Officer and In-House Counsel. Welcome today.
Hi, I'm Julia Judish. I'm Special Counsel with Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman, and I focus my practice on employment law and nonprofit governance.
Welcome to ASAE's first Facebook Live and Periscope session. We've received a lot of questions in advance, but you're welcome to ask live during the session by writing your question on Facebook in the comments section or tweeting them to @ASAE Center. We can't answer every question in this session. ASAE looks forward to future education sessions on this rule. Our goal here today is to help you begin to think about how this is going to impact your business model and what you can do now to prepare. Please email your questions to publicpolicy@asaecenter.org, and our staff will answer any additional questions after the event. If there's any sound difficulty, we encourage you to listen via headphones or to listen on a mobile device. Due to limitations within social platforms like Facebook Live and Periscope, these live feeds will not be captioned. Pursuant to ASAE's accessibility commitment, we will devote resources to encourage participation via the online chat room and then make a captioned recording available shortly after the event. For additional background information, including a client alert from Pillsbury and the DOL guidelines, visit the link provided on Facebook and Periscope at the Power of A website. The Pillsbury Client Alert also includes 9 next strategies for employers, so it's a very useful document for employers.
We're here today to talk about the Department of Labor's new overtime regulations that will dramatically reshape the payroll costs and staffing decisions of all employers, including nonprofit employers for America's workforce. Under the new rule, no one who has a guaranteed salary that is under the threshold of $47,476 will qualify for exempt status under the executive, administrative, or professional exemptions. That means they will be eligible for overtime pay, regardless of their duties, regardless of their current classification, if they earn less than $47,476. This level is more than double the current minimum salary level for exemption of $23,660 annually, and it's only slightly lower than the level that was proposed by the Department of Labor originally when they revised the rules. The new rule goes into effect on December 1st, 2016, although actually for any employees who are being converted, it has to be converted by a full work week, so the end of November is practically, in practice, the effective date. And today we're here to discuss the background of the rule, any potential action that might happen by Congress, and how you can prepare now, the summer and this fall, for implementation of the rule.
And some more background, the final rule was released on May the 18th of 2016. We were very concerned about the impact of the rule, and the DOL did make some positive changes from its first proposed rules that it had released the previous summer. First, the automatic updates to the salary thresholds now will occur every 3 years beginning in January of 2020 instead of every year as in the proposed rule. Also, the new salary levels will be announced 150 days before they take effect versus the shorter 60-day notice period that had been originally proposed. And then also, as Julia mentioned, it is slightly lower than was originally proposed, the salary level. In response to the comments, including from ASAE, that the rule had failed to take into account regional differences in salary, the DOL tied the minimum salary level to the 40th percentile of wages for full-time salary employees in the lowest wage census region, which is currently the South. And that, of course, could change as they look at every 3 years at the different rules.
Importantly, the final rule did not do one thing that the proposed rule had hinted at, which was make any changes to the duties test for the executive, administrative, or professional exemptions. In the proposed rule, there had been suggestions that the Department of Labor would alter the test for exempt duty being the primary duty of those positions, to measure it not by just whether it was the most important duty, but also whether it took up a majority of that employee's time. That would have been, that's currently the rule in California, but for employers located elsewhere, it's helpful not to have to track the time of exempt employees in order to determine whether over 50% of their time is on exempt duties.
We believe the new rule will be a hardship for many association and nonprofits. The ripple effect has the capacity to impact career development, of course budgets, hiring, and employment levels, especially of younger employees, and the ability of employers to allow for flexible work options. For associations and nonprofits that don't currently pay their exempt employees more than $47,476, the new rule may require significant changes in their operations. Now, there are still potential ways that Congress can delay the final rule from going into effect. ASAE is a member of the Partnership for Workplace Opportunity Coalition, which is a diverse group of associations, nonprofits, and businesses who are advocating for a regulation that is considerate of all stakeholder and economic realities facing employers and employees across the country. We took this to Capitol Hill in March as part of our association's Advance America Day, which is our annual legislative fly-in. We held over 250 meetings with congressional representatives and staff to show how this rule would affect associations and nonprofits. We've shared our concerns with the Department of Labor and with the Office of Management and Budget prior to the release of the final rule, but now we've shifted to the potential legislative solution with Congress. However, because President Obama has signaled a willingness to veto any attempt to block enforcement of the new rule, any legislative solution is likely to have broad support from Congress in order to be successful. There is some interest by Republicans in Congress to delay implementation of the rule and also to address the automatic increases. Since this is currently a partisan issue, there's less likelihood of that right now, but some Democratic offices have also been very receptive to our message. We are asking associations and nonprofits that are concerned about the overtime rule to contact their elected representatives in Congress and share how this change is going to affect them and their ability to carry out their mission. The link to ASAE's Engage portal to send a message to your legislators can be found at the Power of A link on Facebook or Twitter. So now we're going to cover a couple of questions that we've already received, and then we'll get to some live questions. As we mentioned at the start, we're not going to be able to answer every question, and we look forward to future education sessions on this rule. But we will try to answer what we can after the fact also if you email publicpolicy@asaecenter.org. So let's go ahead and get to the first question, which is one that affects, I know, many associations. And we've heard this in a number of different ways. We have staff that under the new rule will now be non-exempt. They currently attend our conferences out of town. They work and also mingle with industry colleagues, and all expenses are paid. This type of attendance is valued by staff and the organization and their members. Will we now have to pay overtime for travel, airport waits and delays, breakfast with the boss, a cocktail party they expected to attend? And the answer is, to many of those questions, is yes. For somebody who's newly non-exempt, all work performed or permitted to be performed, suffered to be performed, I think is how the Department of Labor describes it, has to be paid. So when you look first at what our staff tend to do at conferences, they're usually very, very long days, and they're doing a variety of different things. They may be helping to monitor an education session. They may be manning the registration desk. They may be helping out at evening events. If they are non-exempt, that time has to be paid. Now, if you're at a conference and there's nothing for the person to do, and they're free to leave and go back to their hotel room or tour the host city, that time does not have to be paid. But they have to be free to do that. They can't be obligated to have to be there in order to cover something that may have to come up. Evening events are very important in that way. You may decide that it's a great thing to have your staff at a evening event, but if they're required to be there, they have to be paid. Travel is a little different. There is an existing rule on the Department of Labor website that I encourage you to look at that addresses non-exempt travel. Generally, travel within a non-exempt staff member's normal work hours has to be compensated. So if somebody travels to the airport 9 o'clock, gets on a flight at 11, considering the usual TSA delays, gets to the destination a couple hours later and arrives at the hotel at 5, you would pay them from 9 to 5. Interestingly enough, the Department of Labor says you don't have to pay them if the travel, because of delays and other things, extends out beyond the normal work hours. However, as a practical matter, I think a lot of associations, especially for a meeting where the travel time might be quite lengthy, let's say from coast to coast, would likely want to compensate their staff for that. But take a look at those rules, and you need to start figuring out what is going to work for your association. And Julie, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
Yes, so I'll add that when we're talking about travel time, we're talking about travel time as a passenger. So where you can, your employee can sit back and snooze or read the latest bestseller they picked up at the airport bookstore. If they're actually doing work while on the plane, that's working hours. So you'll want to consider who it makes sense to attend and track the hours now so that you are able to anticipate what the impact will be for your association once the regulations go into effect.
All right, and then we have another question, this one from Ryan O'Rourke of Synergos, which is an association management company. What is the period of time that's being regulated? Each week, the pay period? Put another way, can somebody work 50 hours one week and 30 the next for an average of 40? And if it's regulated weekly, is it Sunday through Saturday?
All right, I'll take this question. The work week is the paramount measure under the regulations, the old regulations, the new regulations. Everything is determined by work week. You can set the work week how you wish to set it, as long as you're not moving it around back and forth to try to game the system. So most employers set their work week Saturday to Sunday, or to cover the average, the normal work week. Some associations that have lots of weekend events can deal with that by deciding to have a work week that is, say, Wednesday to Tuesday, and then if there's a lot of weekend work done, the real weekend for those employees in terms of taking time off can be Monday and Tuesday, and that reduces their total tally of hours worked in that employer's work week to closer to 40 or to below 40. But you cannot average hours across two different work weeks, even if they are in the same pay period. Any employee who is non-exempt, who works over 40 hours of actual work time, not counting vacation pay, sick time, but actual work of more than 40, is entitled to overtime pay for the hours over 40. You may choose to, in order to control costs, give them extra time off in the following week in order to keep your budget the same, but you still will be paying them overtime at the premium rate for all hours over 40.
And I would point out that in California specifically, you have to pay overtime for all hours worked in excess of 8 hours in a day. So you have to pay attention to your state regulations also, not just the federal. We had a very good question come in from Chris Cohn. If you're paid over $47,476, does that mean you are exempt and can't do overtime? That's an easy one. Absolutely not. It is, the new threshold is a minimum. You have to make at least that much. If you make below it, you're automatically eligible for overtime. It's not until you exceed over $130,000 a year, and I'm not sure, I forget the exact number, that you would be considered automatically exempt from overtime. So the vast majority of people fit between that 47,000 and 130,000. That's where the duties test comes in. You have to look at whether or not your staff that are making more than that $47,000 actually meet the exemptions within the current Department of Labor rules. And that hasn't changed. That's really has been the same over time. Regardless of how much a person makes, you've got to make sure that you're in compliance with those exemptions if they are an exempt employee.
Yes, and the upper level that to which Bob was referring is for the highly compensated employee exemption. That kicks in only if an employee earns, at this point, $134,004 annually. Like the threshold for regular executive administrative professional exemptions, that is tied to average wages. It's tied to the 90th percentile of average wages and will be adjusted every 3 years. But an employee who earns at least that level, the $134,000 level, and who performs one or more exempt tasks, whether administrative, executive, professional, as their primary duty, is a highly compensated employee, provided that they are paid on a salary basis of at least the required minimum level of the
134,000.
right. They don't have that. Their 134,000 can be in bonuses and other forms of compensation, but they must be paid at the $984 a week of the new level, which is what calculates out to the $47,476. So they can't be paid below what a regular exempt employee is paid, but if they're paid at that high level through bonuses, through true-up payments at the end of the year, then you can make sure they're exempt.
All right, another question. What happens if an employee under the threshold chooses to work more than the 40 hours a week?
Then you have to pay them. You have to pay them the overtime. As Bob mentioned, the statute says that overtime is due if you suffer or permit an employee to work. And their wages are sacrosanct under state wage payment laws. You can't withhold them. If you said, I really don't want you to work any overtime without authorization, and they worked overtime, you would still have to pay them. You could discipline them. You could terminate them for being insubordinate and for causing you to take on additional budgetary costs that you told them you could not afford. But you have to pay them if they in fact work over 40 hours. I have a question here about whether I can clarify my comment about working and traveling on the plane. What I mean is that actual work performed, and this relates to the earlier question, actual work performed is compensable work for non-exempt employees regardless of where they're doing it. If they have their laptop and they're sitting in a beautiful meadow with a beer in one hand and typing away in the other and productively doing work, on a Saturday in Bali, you still have to pay them for that. The special rules relating to travel relate only to when an employee is traveling for a work purpose, not as part of their regular commute, and is a passenger, and so really is able to use that time in some ways for themselves. And that's why the Department of Labor has set rules that says if it cuts across their normal work day during the work week or on the weekends, even on the weekends during their regular work hours, you have to pay them even if they're reading a novel. But you don't have to pay them after those hours, except if they're actually doing work, because then the travel is really irrelevant. The fact is they're writing the memorandum that you told them to write, and it doesn't matter that they're writing the memorandum at 10 p.m. as a passenger on an airplane.
Yes, and to follow along with that, to the prior question, if I allow that work to happen, I may have told the staff member, you can't work overtime, and the staff member does it anyway. You still have to pay them for that time. You can discipline them, you can fire them for working unauthorized overtime, but you still have to pay them. And that goes to another question that we have concerning off-hours work. With all the devices these days, and considering how we're doing the session, mobile phones, iPads, and other tablets and other devices, we've encouraged people to work wherever they can, whenever they can, whatever's convenient. It's a very flexible work policy. But now, for those that are newly non-exempt, whenever they're picking up their phone and answering emails, or otherwise doing work from home or at night because maybe their child's up sick, so they might as well get some work done. You have to have a way to first track that time, and you have to pay that time. Again, it's not a choice. If the work is done, you have to pay for it. So you need to consider this when you're thinking about allowing remote access, and how you're going to handle that. For some organizations, it won't be that big of an issue, but for others, especially with very tight budgets, you're going to have to work with your staff now to train them to be able to properly record that time and to be very careful about how they choose to work outside the normal hours. Thankfully, with a implementation date of December 1, you do have time to think through some of those questions. And one of the first things I would suggest that you do now is for those people that will become non-exempt is to start them on tracking their time. Get them used to it. Have those conversations now that they have to do this. There is really no other choice.
And tracking time is critical because they will be required to track their time, or you will be required to keep track of their time as a non-exempt employee. Even if they don't work any overtime hours. The Fair Labor Standards Act requires employers to keep records of the hours worked every work week by any non-exempt employee. So that's a separate, distinct requirement from paying them overtime and from paying them the minimum wage. There are jurisdictions, such as the District of Columbia, where we're sitting today, that also have heightened record-keeping requirements and require you to record the precise start and end time of non-exempt employees. So one theme that we will repeat a few times is make sure you know the local wage and hour laws of the state where your employees are and comply with those in addition to complying with the Fair Labor Standards Act. So get that cohort of employees who are currently classified as exempt but are earning less than $47,476 annually, get them to start tracking their time now. The Department of Labor, and you can see this on their website, has some frequently asked questions. They have a webinar. They have a guidance for nonprofit organizations. This is available on the Department of Labor website. It's posted on the Power of A website, and they're doing a fairly good job of providing information. And they point out that for federal law purposes, the record-keeping requirement can be satisfied for employees who regularly work no more than 40 hours a week and keep a regular schedule by what they call exception timekeeping. So that you just keep a record of their schedule, but each week make sure you know whether they've worked less or more, and that they send you an email. They don't have to punch in and punch out of a time clock, but you need to have a record of the exact hours they work each week.
And keep in mind that will not work in DC.
Yes. And in California, you need a record of the exact hours they work each day. So we're strongly recommending that you start this requirement now because it will give you a measurement, not an exact prediction of how much they will work after December 1st, but it will give you a measurement over a period of months of what their average work hours are. Not necessarily every week. There will be fluctuations, but we're still in June, so you might get a 4 or 5 month snapshot of this is how much they tend to work in a 4-month period, a third of a year, for this salary that we are paying them. Based on that, one of the strategies that you can take in order to control your payroll costs is to decide, how am I going to pay them? How am I going to actually convert them into non-exempt employees? You can convert them to a non-exempt employee by converting them to an hourly employee. Give them a regular rate. This is your rate. You're now making $15 an hour, or whatever the rate is, and you just tally up how many hours they work each week. That's how many non-exempt employees are paid. There can also be salaried non-exempt employees. You can continue to pay them on a salary basis, but you still have to pay them overtime. So if they are paid on a salary basis and they work overtime, you go back and you calculate their regular rate and you multiply that by 1.5 times their regular rate.
And there's another good question here. Is there any penalty to move these employees to hourly non-exempt and base their new hourly rate on any overtime they worked in their prior capacity? Actually, that's what a lot of organizations are doing. They're looking at the total amount that the affected staff member made over the past year, dividing it by 2080 or 1950, depending on what your work hours are, 40 or 37 and a half or 35, and coming up with an hourly rate that way. That is certainly an acceptable way of trying to manage your costs. However, if you look at it from an employee standpoint, there's another piece you have to consider. And that is, if you build that overtime into their hourly rate, you may have, in fact, reduced the employee's weekly take-home pay, depending on how it all works out. For somebody who's not making a lot of money to begin with, to have their take-home pay that they depend on all the time potentially reduced so that your budget and compensation expense stays the same, that's not going to really feel very good to the employee. So that's a conversation I think you're going to have to manage very, very carefully if you decide to do that. I think another potential issue with this for newly non-exempt employees is you may not have the budget to be able to pay overtime, especially if you're dependent on grants and government contracts, which aren't exempted from this rule at all. That you may have to really now control their activities, where you might not have cared before if somebody took 11 hours to do a particular task. You may now have to require somebody to finish it within the 8 hours. And you may have been okay with that 11 hours because you were allowing social activities during the day, people to get together to talk, to have informal conversations, which is very important to the culture of an organization. But now you have less time to do the work. And one of the things that may very well suffer is that kind of a more open and engaging culture where you guys say, look, you guys sit at your desk and get this done because I can't pay you the overtime now to make this happen. I just don't have the money.
Yes. And so let's talk a little bit more about the money and the different strategies. And some of these strategies are addressed in that nonprofit guidance that the DOL published, but I thought it might be helpful not to talk about this just in the abstract, but to take an employee, Pat, who works 50 hours a week on a regular basis. Pat has a current salary of $35,000 a year and performs exempt duties. So that's above the 23,660 threshold currently. Pat is properly classified. We'll take as given that Pat performs exempt administrative or professional or managerial duties. So here are some options for what to do when you convert Pat to a non-exempt employee and how the math works out for you. Remember, Pat's current salary $35,000 a year and a typical work week of 50 hours a week. You can just convert Pat to hourly by dividing $35,000 a year by the 52 work weeks and by 40 hours, assuming a 40-hour work week. That would result in an hourly rate of $16.83 an hour. But you'll have to pay additional overtime for hours 41 through 50 that Pat works. The total compensation that Pat would then take home at the end of the year would be $48,130. So that's a significant increase in compensation for the work. That would be the same thing if you just paid Pat on the salary basis, because you would also be having to pay overtime at this increased rate of $25.25 an hour. However, if you reverse engineer, I know that Pat works on average 10 hours of overtime a week, and you reallocate the earnings between regular pay and overtime pay, and then Pat's regular rate would not be the $16.83 an hour, it would be down to the $12.26 an hour, plus the overtime costs at a rate of $18.39 an hour, and Pat's salary would come out, if Pat worked at these hours, to $35,062 a year. Pretty much very close to what Pat works now. An alternative approach, and this is one that the Department of Labor includes in their guidance, is rather than viewing Pat as salaried at 40 hours a week, view Pat's salary as compensating Pat at straight time for those 50 hours a week. That salary then would, for hours 41 through 50, already cover the straight time component. And you would only, for those hours, 41 through 50, be paying an extra half time of Pat's rate. If Pat ever works more than 50 hours, you still have to pay at 1.5 times his regular rate, because the salary is only to cover the first 50 hours. Under this calculation, Pat would probably get an annual salary of about $38,500 a year, slightly more than under the other approach. But keep in mind that overtime is due and payable only when actual hours worked exceed 40 in a work week. Assuming your employees take any vacation, have any paid holidays during a work week, there are going to be a number of weeks in which they do not work overtime. They may be paid over 40 hours a week. If they work 9 hours a day the week after Memorial Day and get Memorial Day as a paid holiday, but they will not have actually worked more than 40 hours a week. So when you're doing these calculations, you need to assume that there are weeks your employees will not be earning overtime. You may, in converting your employees from exempt to non-exempt, want to guarantee them, if you're doing this reverse engineering, so they're earning a reduced hourly rate, and you're saying it's okay, you'll make it up in overtime.
Maybe.
Yes, you may want to guarantee them that you will true them up at the end of the year if in your calculation you misestimated, and so you're not in fact giving them a pay cut, that they will have take-home pay of at least their same level, so that you could assure Pat's take-home pay would be at least $35,000. I know that's a bit hard to do orally, but I think it's helpful to see the different numbers.
Yeah, and as you can see, it can be a little bit of a compliance nightmare for you to try to figure this out and then to be able to explain it to your staff. Another related question is, what if a non-exempt employee normally works 37.5 hours within a 40-hour normal work week, or 39.75, and if they're a salaried non-exempt, you're still paying them the same salary. You know, you have some flexibility below the 40 hours. So your obligation to pay overtime doesn't kick in until after they've worked 40 hours in the week. And you can't average that over your 2-week pay period. So if they work 60 hours one week, then yes, you're paying overtime for that additional 20 hours, even if they only work 20 hours the following week. The other thing to consider, and this is how we handle it within ASAE, our normal work week is 37.5 hours. So for non-exempt folks, if they work up to 40 hours, we do pay them straight time for the 2.5 hours between 37.5 and 40, and then time and a half after 40 hours. That's how we do it. There are other ways that you can choose to handle that also.
There's a question here about isn't there a $500,000 threshold for for coverage under the Fair Labor Standards Act? And if you keep your revenues below that, are you safe from this rule? So the Fair Labor Standards Act does cover, it has two forms of coverage. It has what's called enterprise coverage, where any employer that is engaged in interstate commerce, which is pretty much all of us these days, that has over $500,000 a year in revenue is subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act regulations, regardless of the number of employees. There's no exception for small employers. There is, however, another trigger to Fair Labor Standards Act coverage. So if your organization has under $500,000 in annual revenues, it's not covered as an enterprise on an enterprise basis, but your individual employees could be covered. The rule for individual employees is if they engage in interstate activity in commerce as part of their duties on any regular basis, they are individually covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Department of Labor has taken the position that engaging in credit card transactions, regularly being on the phone across state lines, sending emails, because email servers are located all over the place, sending mail, all of that, even if they're physically sitting in your office and never travel to another state, all of that is engaging in interstate commerce. So in actuality, there are very few employers in this country, even with a smaller revenue threshold, whose employees are not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I would recommend that before you decide that you do not have to comply with the regulations for your employees, that you consult with legal counsel about your specific circumstances, because it's a very fact-dependent determination, and there's no categorical exclusion when it comes to the individual coverage.
And keep in mind, it may not be an enforcement measure that catches you on this, but it could be a disgruntled employee that says, "Hey, I wasn't getting paid enough." They leave, they sue, and they come after you for overtime. So even if the state may not be enforcing it, or the Department of Labor may choose not to enforce it for very small organizations, there is still risk and potential liability to you. So you have to, again, I would echo Julia's advice is to, before you go that route, talk to Labor Counsel to make sure that you really understand what your obligations are with this. Great question here, and this one I think I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. It's how do you approach culture? How would you suggest we prevent people from not developing an hourly mindset when you're trying to develop leaders? That I think is one of the biggest issues with this new rule, that we're, especially younger people just starting to get into the workforce, they want to meet with more senior people. They may want to attend dinners. They may want to attend function after hours. But now that's going to be considered work, and you may not have the ability to pay for them to do that. I think it is a tremendous challenge to try to maintain that kind of culture, but yet still to be able to comply with the overtime rules. I wish I had a good answer for that one, but I don't, and Julia, I don't know if you do either.
I think one of the keys here, for a number of reasons, will be educating your workforce, training your managers, and training and talking to your employees so they understand what is happening and why it's happening. the silver lining to this is that the changes that you may feel you need to make to comply with this and to meet your budgetary pressures are changes that everyone else is going to be making too. This is not you are changing your culture and there's a greener pasture elsewhere. Everyone is subject to this rule. And so this is a national change. If people understand they're not being singled out, but you're doing this because you are required to do this to comply with the law, that can help a great deal. And you'll have to educate your managers so that they know how to deal with this. You also want to consider the various strategies you have. Consider and think about what are the really high value activities that your employees do. That is a leadership exercise in itself, to have your employees think about how do I add the most value. And if you have budgetary pressures that are going to require you to trim some of the hours that your employees work once you convert them, if you engage them in the process and help them identify how they feel that they contribute most to the organization and are the best part of the team, or the activities that they feel are most valuable to them in advancing in their career, if you include them in that conversation rather than dictating to them, then that can help ameliorate, I expect, some of the impact on the culture of the workplace.
But it's still, yes, your culture will change. And it may not be the kinds of change that you like or have been working towards. I guess one of the ones that pops out to me very strongly is a results-oriented workforce, where you're just focused on results. You're not focusing on the time that people are putting into a job, and you just want to see that things are happening and happening well, which really does, in many ways, reward the most efficient people. But now you're going to have to track time, and that seems to be a little bit contrary to that idea. So I like Julie's suggestion. You've got to talk to people. You've got to bring them into the process. You've got to make sure that they understand what's going on and why is it happening. But yes, it will change the way you do things and the way some things work. And I don't have a good solution to that at all.
One clarification. Can you please confirm that any paid holiday, vacation, or sick leave does not count towards overtime requirements in an individual week?
Yes, let's repeat that question so it's clear. Paid holiday time, paid vacation time, paid sick leave, paid any time that the employee is not working is not included in the calculation of whether they have worked 40 or more hours a week. So overtime is always tied to actual hours worked, keeping in mind that hours worked is defined for non-exempt employees sometimes to include attendance at conferences to which they are required or expected to show up, travel, sometimes even donning and doffing their uniforms if they have to wear special uniforms. So work hours, though, are all that go into the calculation.
Right. So a good example is this. Let's say in a state that does not have an 8-hour rule, somebody works 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 9 hours a day for 27 hours, and then has 2 scheduled vacation days for another 16 hours. Now, if my math is any good, that's 43 hours. They would be paid 43 hours of straight time. They didn't work 40 hours. They only worked 27, and you're giving them under your leave policy an additional 16 hours of straight time. So that's a good example of when somebody has 40 hours on the timesheet, but because it's not 40 hours worked, you would not have an overtime calculation. That's a very, very old rule that has been out there certainly since I began my career. So if you have your payroll person should be able to handle that one, I hope already.
There have been several questions that have come in asking for clarification about the highly compensated employee exemption. So we'll go back to that one for a moment. So the final rule, all it changed was the salary level for exempt administrative, professional, and executive employees. It also added, by the way, for computer professionals, if they are paid on a salary basis, they also must be paid the $47,476 annually. There is also an exemption, as you may be aware, for certain highly skilled computer professionals who are paid at least $27.63 an hour and can be paid on an hourly basis. They don't have to be paid on a salary basis. The final rule did not affect the outside sales commission employee exemption. There is no salary level test for lawyers, doctors, and teachers. But for those exemptions, it changed the salary level by pegging it to the 40th percentile of average wage earnings and by making it raise, adjusting it every 3 years. It also pegged the highly compensated employee exemption, which is currently at $100,000 of annual compensation. It changed that and pegged it to the 90th percentile of wages nationwide for full-time salaried employees, and that is now set at $134,004, I think.
Yeah. And the key is below 47,000, you have to pay overtime. Above 134, you don't, assuming you meet the criteria. But in between 47,000 and 134, the rule is a person is entitled to overtime, unless they meet the administrative, executive, or professional exemption. This classification issue is also an old issue. This is not new. This has also been going on for years, and we've offered education on properly classifying employees in the past. So that hasn't changed. You still have to make sure that those people that you consider to be exempt staff meet one of those existing exemptions.
And that means that they meet the duties test. They are paid on a salary basis. You don't dock them for working less than expected, with certain exceptions for full day personal absences, and that they're paid at the minimum salary level. If any of those three aren't met, even if they're the CEO, they're entitled to overtime for hours worked over 40. All right. Another issue I want to throw out so that people are aware of it is there, and it's too complicated to get into great detail here, but there is also in the regulations and discussed in the materials the strategy of a fluctuating work week arrangement. This only applies for employees whose hours vary regularly. They don't work a set number of hours. They may work 50 one week and 30 the next. If they are paid on a salaried basis, if you have a written agreement with them that the salary compensates all hours that they work, regardless of how many or how few in a work week, if you do not dock them for hours they work less than 40, you can pay them you must pay them overtime for all hours worked over 40, but only at a half-time rate, because their salary is viewed as compensating them for all of the hours. If you get this wrong, you can get hit with significant penalties. So again, this is something you'll want to implement very carefully, but it is a way to continue paying your employees on a salaried basis and to reduce the economic financial hit from having them convert into overtime eligibility.
And here's a follow-up. I am part-time and roughly half the minimum, but I'm an executive, so I'm clearly an exempt employee. So can I be converted to an hourly employee even if my job is exempt? Absolutely, yes. If you don't make at least $47,000, then you are eligible for overtime under the new rule.
Right. And you
you're-
won't be exempt.
And you will not be exempt. And there is absolutely no flexibility in that. And I think for, especially outside the major urban areas, that is going to be a huge challenge for a lot of nonprofits and associations, that even their executives now are required to be paid overtime.
Yes, and so, and let me address two issues about that. First, the Department of Labor has made clear that the 913 hours a week and
Dollars.
dollars a week, yes, is fixed. It is not prorated for someone who is part-time. So a part-time employee who earns less than that will be non-exempt. Of course, most part-time employees don't work more than 40 hours a week, but there are some weeks in which they may. If they don't earn that minimum, at least the $47,476 a year, they are non-exempt. You don't get to prorate it based on their full-time equivalent hours. A question has come in about whether bonuses impact that amount. For highly compensated employees, as long as they earn at least the $913 a week, you can add as much bonus or commission, discretionary, otherwise, as you want to reach that amount at the end of the year. For everyone else, only 10% of their $47,476 can be based on bonuses or other compensation that's not salary. There's a few additional requirements. That must be non-discretionary. In other words, guaranteed extra payments to which the employees are entitled. And it must be paid no less frequently than every quarter. There is an allowance for at the end of the year being able to do one catch-up payment, but you can't rest on more than 10% of their compensation being calculated into the $47,476.
Yeah, there's still there's been a few more questions come in about travel time. I would encourage you to read about those on the DOL website. It can be very complicated. For example, what about overnight travel? Could that count as hours worked? Maybe not. If somebody doesn't normally work the overnight shift, and they're choosing to travel overnight, you may not have a payment obligation. But look at those rules. You need to take some time to familiarize them yourself with them, and then to be able to really teach your staff how to manage within those rules.
And one of the things that the Department of Labor actually does very well is it has published a number of fact sheets that are available online. If you put in your search bar DOL fact sheet, and then the issue about which you want to learn more, DOL fact sheet working hours, you'll get up with travel time, DOL fact sheet outside sales, or executive exemption. They're usually 2-pagers that summarize very well what the requirements are. And so I encourage you to let your fingers do the work for you on the internet and to consult those resources.
So with that, I'd like to go ahead and wrap up today's session. Thank you for joining us today for ASAE's first Facebook Live and Periscope event. The closed caption video will be available shortly and will be posted on ASAE's YouTube, and we will send out a link to anyone who registered in advance. If you have any additional questions, please email publicpolicy@asaecenter.org or write a comment on Facebook or Twitter. Thank you for joining us today.